Hey, Untangled Faith listeners, I am sharing this bonus audio with you today to give you a taste of some of the things I'm sharing in the Untangled Faith Patreon community. This is a conversation I had with Emily Snook at the end of December of 2022 to talk about some of the biggest stories of the year in religion news. There's no way we're going to be able to cover everything that's important that happened this year. We're going to miss some things. But it will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what was on our lists. I'm writing down one more thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I have like 15 things on my list.
Oh, wow.
Um, and I'm not going to say that they are the most important or the top. I'm just going to say they are some influential things. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, bad news makes a bigger splash. But I
Mhm.
feel like it's important to pay attention to bad news because I think paying attention to bad news, I'm gonna say bad news in quotes, it's paying attention to the news and it can make us
Mhm.
better people. Whether
Yeah.
you agree with me.
I do. I like that you came with notes and I came with my brain
You came with
because
your
usually it's the opposite. Usually I've like made a bunch of notes. I
brain.
do have a couple of things saved in my phone though. So
So my trick to figuring out a few things is like I'm gonna go on Twitter and I'm gonna do an advanced search of like certain religion journalists by
mhm.
month. And I'm like, what were they talking about in January and February and March?
Oh, that's smart. I
And I looked at
I
the top
kept
ones, not everyone. So
I kept looking things up to see if they actually happened this year or not because time is a flat circle. And I just have no idea like
well,
when things
yeah.
happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not going to go in chronological order, but like as you were thinking of like top or influential or things that were like top of your mind as you thought about 2022, what is the first thing you thought of that you would mention?
I want to actually kind of zoom out from what our normal
Let's zoom out.
world is and also have a little bit of recency bias.
Oh, so
Um
much.
I think the protests in Iran coupled with the protests in France, which are really different sides of the same coin, right? Like forced adherence to religious code and then forced secularism. And both of the things are kind of converging on Muslim women or just women who are living in a Muslim country like Iran. And so um, I think it's really important to kind of look at those bigger scope things and see what they can tell us about
That's a
sort
huge
of
deal.
where we're at because
It's
it's
this is happening all over the world in
right.
secular world and progressive world in different religions.
Yeah, and to be very Baptist for a minute, like we should care about the religious liberty of Muslim women who want to wear a hijab in Europe and can't, or of women who are under an Islamic nationalism, um, who want to choose to not wear hijab and can't because religious liberty is a human rights issue. But for us as believers in Jesus and a Baptist idea is the idea of soul freedom, right? And that's
Mhm.
where freedom of religion comes from. And so that we want every person to be able to have that expression of their soul freedom of conviction. And so for us as Christians in America, like both sets of those women in another religion are things that we should care about.
Oh,
Um,
Emily, this has implications. I'm so glad you mentioned
yeah,
that because I think it's easier to see that and be like, of course, people should not be forced to have to follow somebody else's religious convictions.
or
That,
be able to and still be able to participate in society.
right. And
And
and how does that influence the way we think about religious liberty in
Mhm,
our own context? And I'm thinking about Dobbs
mhm,
and the laws in different states that in some horrifying ways, we cannot look away from and see how making things illegal
Mm-hmm.
is becoming as problematic here. On the same, we're starting on a spectrum. We're not killing people, right? But
Mm-hmm.
are we willing to like throw people in jail for not following our religious convictions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think Dobbs, the marriage law that was just signed a
Oh,
couple of days
absolutely.
ago, like, which I mean, I gonna recommend David French on it, like we
So
do
much.
constantly, because it is that balance of like religious liberty is everybody's religious liberty, and so that means coexisting together with people who have different convictions, and also like having a respect and an honor for how they live out their own convictions, right? And because here's the thing about it, Amy, is that if we really believe what we believe is true,
Mhm.
then other people having a freedom of choice in how they want to live their lives shouldn't be a threat to us,
Yeah.
because what we're offering is as beautiful and true as we say that it is, then there is no threat to that. There's just an invitation.
Yeah.
And so like I'm going to celebrate the maximum amount of soul freedom for the maximum amount of people and work for that, whether that's women taking off a hijab in Iran or putting one on in France, or people getting married or choosing not to participate in someone's wedding, or trying to nuance abortion policy that has respect for every person's life and every person's convictions, and how do we do that in a pluralistic society? Like it's harder.
Emily, I was just
And
going to say that pluralistic idea is that how do we do that, right? This
yeah.
is a conversation we that is starting more, and I think it's going to
Mhm.
just continue to become more and more important.
Mhm.
It's part of loving our neighbors, and
Yeah.
and that difference between threatening somebody into the kingdom
Mhm.
and inviting them, and then and
Mhm.
also the understanding that yeah, the Bible says that narrow is the road, but
Mhm.
I also believe that the kingdom is wider than we think, and when we make
Mhm.
everything a heaven or hell, disqualify you from being in community with me issue that isn't spelled out in the Bible. I mean, that
Mhm.
the guy on the cross next to Jesus, Jesus says,
Mhm.
today, you'll be with me.
Mhm.
I think we need to keep having these conversations and think about what it means to
Yeah.
hold on to our convictions, and also in a way that leaves space
Mhm.
for our neighbors that are convicted different in a different way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think sometimes, I mean, we're probably going to get very narrowly focused on white evangelical
Yeah,
American
that's our world.
stuff in a minute, but I think having that broad scope view helps us to really see where we are clearly, because it's not just Iran, it's not just here where we have a rise in Christian nationalism. Like there's a rise in Hindu nationalism in India, and violence and state-sponsored violence against Muslims and Sikhs and Christians. And then there's, the nationalism of Russian Orthodoxy and how that's playing out with the war in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian church that is um there's the Ukrainian church, and then there's the Russian Ukrainian church, and how that nationalism is working itself out there, and there's things happening in South America that kind of parallel all of that stuff. And so recognizing that, like, this thing that we're dealing with in sort of our little narrow focus of, like, there is a troubling and dangerous rise in explicit white Christian nationalism
Yeah,
within
that's on
American
my list.
evangelicalism. There's also a rise in just nationalism and religious nationalism specifically, generally.
Yeah, it's a global thing.
It's a global thing. It's across nations. It's across different religions. Religious liberty is is not our natural state as humans.
Yeah, and there's
Um,
interesting gatekeeping that is happening
mhm.
there. And if you look globally, I think we see some more of that the results of what happens. If you look like in Europe, we look
Mhm.
at Brexit and we look at what happened when, they're like, we just want to be us.
Mhm.
And then you fail to see the beauty of all of the contributions in a society that
Mhm.
suddenly like they're like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
when we shut the door here and we drew that really hard line,
Mhm.
we made everything worse and we
Mhm.
made everything harder
Mhm.
because we failed to see all the interconnectedness.
I mean, and you also see the implications of it in playing out in India. So, like for example, there's it. Listen, it's fine for you to become a Christian if you're lower caste, or if you're even like in middle caste, but then you stop getting help from the caste system because you're outside of it now. And so, like, no, you don't technically have to be Hindu, but
Mm.
if you want the societal structure that is enforced both through mores and through laws to benefit you, then you better be inside of it. And so even when it's not resulting in things like violence in, like, say, Kashmir or whatever, like there's still a cost um, to individual people, and an oppression and a dehumanization of whole classes of people,
Mhm.
and like, man, that should make us nervous. We should not look at that and say, well, okay, that won't be us. Like, Christians won't do that. Like, the 20th century would beg to differ.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a thing I've been thinking about of, now that we've been in a pandemic for a while, and the kind of fracturing of the global psyche, that that COVID did, is that there's, I think, a lot of time that comes out as fear response, right? And so there's been this rise of, with a lot of things factoring into it, of an us versus them mentality,
Yeah.
just across the board, not just in our little world. And I think that if we want to be prophetic witnesses to the gospel in a world that's dividing up in us versus them in all of these different ways, in all these different places, then I wrote down the quote, but I forgot to write down who said it, so this isn't me. But the gospel is not us versus them. It's it's God with us for them.
Mm.
And so we're not in an us versus them fight for our survival. God has invaded human history to be with us for the sake of them.
Mhm.
And so if that's how we're interacting with people who have different convictions than us and all those things, then it takes out the threat. And it also offers them that beauty and that goodness that I was talking about before. And so I think it's really important for us to zoom out and then also kind of zoom in and examine ourselves and see if what we're doing looks like those other things.
Yeah, those are good points. Are you ready to zoom in on white
Yeah, let's zoom in.
evangelical American happenings? I would argue one of the biggest things in the news because of like where we are located in our own
Mhm.
evangelical world is the guidepost report from the
Yeah.
SBC that came out in May.
Hmm.
That there was so much tied up to that.
Hmm.
Finding out that leaders in the SBC did have a list of people that were credibly accused.
Yeah. When they said that it was not legal for them to do so over and over and over again to survivors. Yeah.
Yeah, that at the same time they were saying that they actually had that. And then there was names in that report that people did not know
Hmm.
about that had some very serious allegations of abuse that they
Hmm.
had perpetrated based on their power differentials and other things. And
Hmm.
that came out in May. And then what time of year do they have their annual meeting?
In
Was it
June. It was
June?
just a few weeks difference. Yeah.
And then around the time that June thing happened, the Daily Wire reporting that started calling into question and Megan Basham's
Mhm.
like ethical questionable behavior as a journalist and how she dealt with
Mhm.
survivors and questioning. the validity of the guidepost report, questioning survivors in a way that is frankly horrifying. The ripple effects of this are still happening. There's a new
Yeah.
lawsuit that's been attached to this that it feels like
Well, and the
Wire reporters
DOJ
have been a part of.
investigation, definitely, if we're talking about American evangelicalism, the number one thing is the guidepost report, because it's, I mean, it's like evangelical spotlight. It's a weird thing, like, because this is my world.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was shocked and horrified and not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the conversation that I was having with people over and over and over again, who have been, but then people who I know who, I mean, they just couldn't believe it. It was just, I mean, it was earth shattering, I think, to a lot of people. And there's this tension of, okay, well, like that came out in May and like nothing's happened. And that's true. And then also, I think, like, there are people like Krista Brown who have been doing this for decades. And there are people like me who have been, doing this for 7, 8 years, whatever, like in this sort of
Was
specific
that
way.
reporting the first time
And
Krista was like specifically mentioned as like in a way that was like she's saying the truth,
yeah,
like
pretty
officially?
much. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't in an official like way, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been individual officials who have done that, but I'm not really sure. But I don't want to speak for her. But it's a vindication, and then it's also like
It's
not.
heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, yeah. And so but I also think that there are a lot of people who just they are just now starting to see things that they just weren't capable of seeing before. And so I'm in a position of like one day I'm like, burn it all down, sell all the seminaries, like we're done. Like we were born in slavery, we're gonna die in sex abuse scandal, and like God have mercy on us. And
Mhm.
then some days I'm like, okay, but like, what if we could be a picture of actual like reparative redemption?
Mm.
And that would be like the like, Southern Baptists are all about like, missions and evangelism and the gospel above all. And but like, what if we could actually live that in a way where we had costly repentance that was transformative and reparative and restorative? Like, that would be us taking the gospel to all nations. And so I hold those two things in tension. And my thing is like, whichever one happens is good with me. Like it's
Let God work it out, right?
um, but I think it's hard for someone who doesn't. I think there are a lot of people who have have seen have seen the darkness for so long
Mhm.
that they don't, that it's hard to have grace for people who are just kind of blinking and adjusting to it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Um,
But we've seen
and
some hope. I mean,
yeah, and
the
so
elections that have happened at the annual meeting have pointed to some the members that are showing up.
I mean,
The people in the
I
congregations.
fluctuate between it's all just surface, like people aren't really ready to do what's required of us.
Mhm.
Like I fluctuate between that and we didn't get to this place in 6 months.
Right,
We
right.
got here
It'll take longer.
we got here in 200 years,
Mhm.
or however many years, 150 years, whatever. We have a lot of untangling to do about valuing people over institutions, and understanding that like the mission does not make sin okay.
Yeah.
And all those things, like those things are woven into our DNA. And so the question is if we're going to be able to sort of unwind that and become who we say that we are.
Yeah.
Um, or if we're gonna give some sort of like lip service, like cosmetic things and some policies, and it's not going to really be that costly for the most part. Um, or if God is just going to turn us over to let our own sin be the end of us, like
Yeah.
one of those three things is going to happen, and like every day I feel different about it.
Yeah, I think we hold both of it.
Yeah,
It's yeah, both the thing of like, we really need to do more than this little tiny thing.
yeah.
And the okay, but I had to get here one step at a time myself.
Mhm.
And if somebody just required me to run a marathon before I was even able to do a 5K, I wouldn't have done anything.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a tension. But when lives are literally at risk, it
right.
feels like there's an urgency where
Mhm.
you want to be like, come on. Like I was
Yeah.
talking to my husband about the lawsuit from Sills against the SBC and others. I was like, I am afraid this sort of lawsuit is going to cost people their lives literally. And
Mm,
I
me
don't say
too.
that lightly. I say that the odds of that sort of thing happening, and not just even in the specific case, are high
Mhm.
because it's just a devastating, horrible situation to be in.
Mhm.
I think this is going to be a challenge for all of white evangelicalism and maybe the church at large in the world is really understanding power dynamics
Mhm.
and defining abuse as abuse and not saying and not getting fatigued by the word and the conversation. It'd be
Mhm.
easy to get fatigued. It would be easy to get desensitized. And I see those that are worried. I see those that are protecting their power more, pushing back about, hey, when you call everything abuse, then nothing is abuse. And people are saying that we're using the word too loosely. And I
Mhm.
mostly see that from people that have something to lose,
Mhm.
power and influence wise, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever the case may be. But I do think this is going to be a big theme going forward. What does this mean? Who are we trusting to define this for us? What is an affair? What's the difference between an affair and an abusive relationship? And how do power dynamics play into that? We need to listen to those that have done the study, mental health professionals.
Mhm.
There are people that have studied these things that we need to defer to.
Mhm.
And do you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
I mean, I think the probably my last thing to think about it is that like I've been having this conversation for a while in SBC world, and the main pushback that I've gotten from people who I think are good people who want to do the right thing and really do feel feel like abuse happened and should be dealt with, but there's always this pushback of, but we're doing all of these other good things. And I just want to say, like as a Southern Baptist growing up, I was taught to take the scripture seriously
Mhm.
and to take the gospel seriously. And I cannot find in the Bible where God sees his people causing harm and says, but it's okay because you're doing these other good things. Like that's the opposite of the gospel. The gospel is like, even these things that we do are not good. And but God being rich in mercy has sent Jesus to transform those things through costly sacrifice and to make right everything that has been wrong. And so, if we're going to paper over bad things for the sake of good things and call that the gospel, then we might as well just bring every missionary home
Mhm.
because that ain't it. I want our focus to be what where can we name sin fully and unabashedly and then be busy about repenting of it and repairing it so that those good things are not paper
Yeah.
over a false gospel that does not take sin seriously.
One of the big stories of the year that I feel like hasn't got the attention that it should have, and maybe it's just because of all the things in the world, is
Mm.
Nancy French's reporting on
Mm.
Kanakuk. The
Yeah.
Kanakuk camp is probably the most influential Christian camp in the United States. And
Yeah.
in regards to the amount of reach that they have, the number of campers that go there, and the number of Christian influencers that send their children there.
Yeah.
It is very expensive.
I was going to say,
It's like
I
the elite
never,
place for the
it's,
fancy
it's,
folks to
it,
send.
I was never cool enough or rich enough for Kanakuk. But it is very culturally influential because it's where Christians of privilege send their kids.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean, I can
Mhm.
think of really influential people. I feel like Jenny Allen had a connection to Kanakuk. I know
Everybody, like
everybody, a lot of
yeah.
the Nashville evangelical industrial
Um,
complex send their
it's
children there.
very ubiquitous in
Mm,
white evangelical culture from the 90s to now. Like
yeah.
if you grew up in that time period and you like sports or your parents had money or you know, were like the cool youth group kid, like you
I feel
went
like
to
Shauna
Kanakuk.
Niequist went there back in the day and maybe worked there as a high schooler.
Yeah, I don't
I could
know.
be making that up. All that to say, if you have money and you're somebody in the Christian world, it's very common to send your kid to this camp. And what
Hmm.
has really been disappointing is I haven't heard anything from any of those folks
Yeah,
that have influence and have the ear of a lot of people.
yeah.
In fact, I think many of them just kept sending their kids.
Hmm.
And like the too long didn't read is that they had employees, one in particular. Was there more than one? I know that one in particular,
There's more than one, but there's one
serially
like a high
sexual
up. Yeah.
abuser, has been convicted.
Hmm.
Um, and instead of being really clear with parents and campers of what has happened, to reach out and let people know and to find the full impact of what has happened and all of the
Hmm.
survivors, they shut down survivors. They like bribed them to be quiet, bought them
Hmm.
like technology and asked them to sign away their right to speak about it, which is
Hmm.
horrifying. I mean, you think you send your
Yeah,
kids away and
yeah,
it's scary anyways. You need to trust that they are in good hands.
yeah,
And I am surprised that
yeah.
more
And
people haven't
I,
cared
I
about it.
think, I think you're right about the number of influential people with ties to Kanakuk who have said not a single word, or who have said, "I had a great experience there." Like that's like I that it's back to the papering over your harm with good. Like when we judge whether or not something is bad based only on our relationship with it
Yeah.
and not on how it affects other people, then we're making ourselves the center of what is good and what is not good.
And the least powerful ends up being the most hurt.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I actually want to zoom out a little bit again and talk about this in the context of another issue, which is the sort of QAnonification of talking about child abuse
Oh, yeah.
within the American church. Like people that know me know that I have been like, hey, this is bad, about QAnon being sort of mainstreamed into evangelical culture for years, like the whole
Mhm.
Save the Children thing and Wayfair and basically like things from the dark depths of the dark web being mainstreamed into influencer Instagram and Facebook memes and all these things and so what happens is you have all of these conspiracies, right, about groomers and pedophiles and elementary schools and all of these things and and they're based on nothing
Mhm.
at best,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
But it's sort of in the water, it's in the air, and it kind of has been for a while, and people haven't really noticed it. They've acclimated to this. It's like when there's like a okay, so when I was a trainer in high school for football, there was a cat that kept getting into our visitor locker room area and storage area, and it would get in there and it would pee on like the, like the um sports like industrial carpet that's just like carpet over a concrete
Yes.
floor, right?
Yes.
Coach's office, like our changing areas and storage areas smelled like cat pee. And I'd spray like disinfectant on it, and like the disinfectant would like clean it, but like the cat pee smell never really went away. But I was in there every day, and I got to where I kind of couldn't smell it anymore, right?
Mm.
But then other football teams would come and they would be like, there's something dead in here. Because they would walk in and smell it, and then I would have to be like, oh no, that it's cat pee in the carpet. It's cleaned. I promise. We just can't get rid of the smell. Like, and so I would forget that it smelled like cat pee because it was
Mhm.
just the air that I breathed every day. But when someone would walk in, they would smell it, right? And that's kind of what has happened with the sort of QAnonification of child abuse in our culture, is
Mhm.
that we've all been acclimated to the cat pee. And so now when someone like Nancy French does real investigative journalism with real harm and real victims and real proof, right? Like legal
Mhm.
proof, then it's just lost because the air just already smells bad.
Yeah.
And so these two things live together, right? Of this being underreported and not mattering like it
Yeah.
should. I think that coexists in a sort of symbiotic way with our noses being poisoned by cat pee, of this sort of groomer pedophile hysteria
Yeah.
that that makes it so that we don't, either we think that everything is it or we think that nothing is it. And so it's made us sort of culturally incapable of taking real
Mm.
things seriously because ridiculous things have been called real for so long. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I was clicking over here because I was remembering that Shannon Martin had shared a thread on Twitter recently that was very connected to this. It was way back and in November. And she said white evangelicals 10 out of 10 prefer what they can't see to what they can see.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows. I'm going to read this. She says there are people being oppressed, dying from racism, homophobia, gun violence, and poverty, and they'd rather talk about the end times. 5-year-olds are being shot to death during circle time. They'd rather talk about the unborn. An insurrection took place on live TV. They'd rather talk about a riot they heard about from Sean Hannity. While COVID deaths were stacking up in hospital hallways, they want to talk about Wayfair cabinets and rumors of satanic cabals. We have broken healthcare, broken schools, cities without safe drinking water, mass incarceration, modern slavery. They want to talk about focusing on joy, daily quiet time, not being divisive, and Israel. 90% do not know why they're supposed to throw this last one around, the Israel one. Yeah, it is so fascinating. We have the proof that something is actually happening, and there's much more of a, but what about the
Mm-hmm.
theoretical thing that maybe most likely 100% was made up, right? There's some real things like the unborn is real, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but this Wayfair thing and all these other things of, and Christians saying, I have to support Trump because of child abuse and trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, what about this real child abuse case that's happening that
Yeah.
nobody is talking about?
Even if we're going to distill it down just to like a religion thing, right? Like in Oklahoma, um, there there's been this massive demonization of public schools by public figures, um,
Same
and
in Nashville. Mm-hmm.
and calling it protecting kids
Mm-hmm.
from pedophilia, from grooming, from CRT, whatever, and it's couched in this religious language. Um, and so uh and so when you make a boogeyman out of protecting children, then when they actually need protection, well, man, people don't believe in the boogeyman. That's not real. Or they're so concerned from what's in front of them. And so it has an effect on both sides of the camp, right? Like on the people who buy into the conspiracy, well, like this over here is just a distraction, and this is so much worse. Or people are just complacent, or they just they don't know what to believe anymore, and so they just don't care about any of it. Like whatever, it's like everything's bad, nothing's bad. And so that's why it matters for us to speak with precision and honesty about what things are, and not
Mm-hmm.
demonize. And like we talked about before, the us versus them thing. Like if we're going to sacrifice the truth in an us versus them culture war, then the casualties of that war are going to be people who actually need those definitions to mean things.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so that when those things come up, people understand, can see, and can act to protect them. And so what's happened is we've had this confluence, and then things like, I mean, Nancy French, like her work is heroic. Like she basically like didn't have a job for years so she could investigate this.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, like, I mean, I have mentioned it to people that I know in real life who sent their kids to Kanakuk this summer, and they've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I send them the articles, and they're like, oh well, they didn't go to that camp. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I don't know how.
But
I don't
what
know,
about the fact that they have a very bad track record of knowing
like
whether or not their campers
like
are safe?
and we're in a place where like you can't even have a conversation about it
Mm-hmm.
because we're operating in a world where nothing means anything.
Yeah, it's just so gross. It's so gross. Um, are we gonna talk about you cussing? Because somebody wanted to talk about that, Emily, and I
It's
missed that.
it's probably not gonna happen.
Okay. Um, somebody mentioned this. I thought it was important. The whole like, and this isn't just a thing, it is like it's a idea, a movement. I don't know how to describe it. The abuse survivor community is finding their voice, and it's figuring out how to do this, right? Some people have been in the game for a long time, in the fight for a
Mhm.
long time, and those that are just sort of jumping in the pool. And some people know how to swim and some don't. And there have been some false starts. You know, even this last spring, where there was some pushback against Julie Roy's leading her own conference because of some things that she had written. We have never talked about that on the show. Somebody messaged me to ask about that. And I thought that is a really interesting conversation to have, because we're all sort of struggling with how do we be consistent and have integrity and hold our own selves, even those in the survivor space, accountable. Um, and then also, like, there's no rules here, right? There's no like playbook or like best cases. This is the best case way of how to handle this sort of thing. And Julie removed herself from her conference. Um, she listened to some people, and I think she made the decision that she needed to make so that she couldn't distract from the good work that was being done. Hey, I have not agreed with the way Julie has handled everything, but I have been thankful that it looks like she's failing forward. And I think it's sort of like what you and I said earlier, Emily, about are we going to make somebody run a marathon that hasn't run a 5K yet? And I feel like she's working on her running a mile and showing that she has the ability to run a 5K, and has listened to pushback, even though initially there was resistance and defensiveness happening there. But I think all of us are trying to figure out the best way to do this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that um I think that the measure for me is going to be is like you said, kind of falling forward. But I think the thing for me about it is that like what it are they willing for it to cost them for them to do better, right?
Hmm.
And so that's what we see with Julie is that she she keeps demonstrating repentance that is costly to her, not to other people, and learning that that is I haven't seen her trying to make herself an expert or say that
Hmm.
she does everything right or any
Yeah.
of those things. And so I think that the posture of the person matters a whole lot because none of us are going to do it perfectly, but if our posture is how dare you accuse me, like
Yeah.
then um then that's different than I'm still figuring out how to do this. Thank you for giving me grace. Help me do it better. Those two things are really different to me. And so yeah, I mean, we want to have that, you know,
Yeah, and I think it shows the importance of having people in your life that are willing to say
mhm,
things to you. Because I think we saw that play out. Like there was
yeah,
trustworthy people that reached out and said, "Hey, I love you. I love the work you do. I think you should talk to a counselor, and I think you should get outside somebody outside of the situation
mhm,
to talk you through this to see if there's like a blind spot here."
mhm,
Uh, and a lot of times we surround ourselves with people that would never tell us that. That
mhm,
would just be like, "You're great. Everything you do is
mhm.
wonderful. You can't possibly improve." And what good does that
Yeah.
do any of us?
Yeah, and I think that we kind of get in our head that like we can either have accountability or grace, but like they're not enemies. Like they're, if we're talking scripturally, like they're the justice and mercy are the same, right? They come together. And so we can hold people accountable in a way that is specific
Hmm.
and has clear reparative
Hmm.
things that they're doing and show grace to them at the same time. Where we get into trouble is where we either say like you've messed up, you're done, or you have to show me grace and I don't have to do anything to prove that I'm trustworthy.
Yeah.
Like um and and so we always have this kind of false dichotomy there, that we see being played out over and over, right? And so I think Julie is a good example of letting those two things be together.
Hmm.
um and then we have lots of examples um of kind of people like if Julie's response to that whole thing had been, I've been working all of this time, like you know, talked about what it cost her for to do the things that she did with James McDonald, and like, how dare you say that I don't do these things, whatever. Like, but that wasn't her response. Her response
Hmm.
was, I'm really sorry. Like like here is specifically where I messed up.
Hmm.
Here is specifically how I'm going to have accountability for myself
Hmm.
in that and growth in that. And then like you decide how to trust me in it.
No
That
demands.
that's
Yeah.
that's
I
a
mean, you
real
let the chips fall where they will, and
yeah.
you see what happens. I mean,
And that's a really different posture than say a mega pastor who stands on a stage and ambiguously almost confesses to nothing
yeah.
and then ambiguously is somehow restored for no reason. And if you don't just accept that, then you're the problem.
Yeah. And that was a big part of this year too, the whole Matt Chandler situation at the Village Church, that there was such ambiguity from the
Mhm,
very beginning. We don't even know, and we don't know why. They didn't say it was to protect at the request of somebody that was less powerful or that had been
mhm,
impacted, the whistleblower, maybe. We do not know because they did not communicate. The communication has been really disappointing.
mhm,
And I tend to lean towards like, hey, if they could have been more clear in a way that had made us understand and appreciate Matt's situation better, I think they would have. And it makes me wonder why they weren't more clear. Because I feel like
Mhm.
it's possible, and I could be wrong, that being more clear could have cost them more in
Mhm.
regards to reputation of Chandler and others. And I just wish people trusted God enough, that the gospel was big enough to be clear about the situation. And it makes me sad. And then the same thing with Johnny Hunt is that, like, we have some pastor friends of his that decide, we know that we were just told recently that you had an abusive relationship with somebody, um, sexual abuse, power differential happening in this relationship. It's not a relationship. It was a abuse. And friends of his are like, he's good. He's back. He's back.
Mhm.
And this is a pastor. These are
Mhm.
pastors. When you work in a pastoral role, that it's different.
Mhm.
And I think this is a conversation we need to continue to have about, what does it mean? What does accountability mean? What does it mean to forgiveness and restoration? And how does that work with, maybe you don't need to be a pastor again?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
yeah, the rush to bring people back on stages is just real sad. And it shows, I think it shows a misunderstanding of what being a pastor is all about.
Yeah. Well, and I think also like I think the real issue for me with the Chandler situation is the the pattern of TVC and of Acts 29 churches in general to try to control the narrative, um, through NDAs, through just having the biggest, loudest platforms, all of those things. And so when something is like, well, wait, this doesn't make sense, there's not benefit of the doubt because of your pattern, right? And then again to the posture of like, if you have a problem with this, that's because you like don't respect authority, hate pastors, hate whatever. And like and really, and so it like I think that you're right, probably that if it were possible to say more things, they would have, because of the way that people were just like, wait, what?
Yeah.
um, but I mean, I think that there's just such this institutional us versus them protectiveness that is so deeply, like I just keep talking about this in every story that we talk about, because I think it's really the root of a lot of things, that it's so deeply woven into us, and maybe has always been there since, like I don't know, like the Scopes monkey trial days, like, um of this, like, this deep, like, we have to protect the church. We have to protect the brand. We have to protect whatever. And like, it just is not our job to protect the church. Like like nobody when named us the Holy Spirit. Like not a single person.
Yeah.
And like and like you said, it's a lack of trust in God, because if we really believe that Jesus establishes his church upon our confession of faith in him, and then the Spirit seals it, and that nothing can stand against it, then we do not have to protect it, especially not from the truth.
Mm.
And so I think what happens a lot of times is that we say we're protecting the church, but what we're really doing is protecting ourselves.
Mhm.
We're protecting we're protecting what we believe about ourselves. We're protecting our positions and our power, like some of
Mhm.
those people. But I think that we're also protecting ourselves from the hurt of bad things being true about people that we admire.
Oh
And
man, that's a word. That is a word.
and so
Oh man.
what I think happens is that people like us who have already had those things break, then we already know what it's like to come out of it on the other side. And so we're not we know that it's going to be painful, and we know all those things, but like we don't have to protect ourselves from it anymore. and so that conflict sometimes I think is with people who have already had those images shattered,
Mm-hmm.
being like, okay, but like this thing that you believe isn't real. Like this person is it that they are not who you think they are,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't know them, that that a thing that we believed about ourselves may not be true. Like, yes, that is painful,
Yeah.
but the truth is still true. And so I think a lot of that tension and a lot of that people being like, well, you just hate the church, you're just attacking the church, whatever, is that like it it's that fear of, if what we're saying is true, then what does that say about them?
Mm-hmm.
And that gets played out over and over and over again, and people not being willing to hear the truth about other people because
I feel like people think that
because
they
it,
have a relationship sometimes with these people that they don't have.
well, and
Caitlin
it
Beatty
just,
talked about that a little bit about the
yeah.
proximity thing. Like all we see is this thing,
Mhm,
and we like what we're getting from these people, right?
mhm,
And we have this false relationship with them that's really one-sided, and
yeah,
then it feels threatened. I think that's one of
yeah,
the things.
yeah. And well, and it's the I mean, part of it is, I mean, sometimes, and then sometimes there is a relationship there, right? Like not everybody goes to the village church, but people do.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and so like, yeah, like, of course those guys, it whatever happened, like, of course those guys don't want to believe that it's something that's bad and that's disqualifying. Of course those pastors that Johnny Hunt mentored and that they modeled their lives and ministry after don't want to believe that he is irredeemable, because we're connected to each other, and it says something about us. And when we put trust in other people, and then we realize that that trust is ill-founded, what it actually
yeah,
does is, rather than shaking our trust in them, it shakes our trust in ourselves. Like, how can I trust myself to judge what's true? How can I trust myself to believe other people if I have been so wrong?
yeah,
And so it's easier just to deny the evidence
yeah. The
of
implications are
that you
big.
could be wrong, because the implications are big, and they are painful. Like, I have been so wrong about people,
Mhm.
and and there are a couple of people where I carry that around every day, and it affects my
People you
life.
promoted, yeah, people that
Yeah,
we put in
people,
time for, invested in,
yeah,
defended, that
and
you knew personally.
people that I knew in real life who were important to me, informative for me.
Hmm.
And so, and that it's a thing I carry, but like but but I don't want to carry around a false idol of a person.
Yeah.
It's not worth that. And I'm not gonna be able to be like who I used to believe myself to be. Like, I want to actually be that person.
Hmm.
And I'm not going to be able to become that person by pretending that I always have been.
Mm, that's
And
good.
and so again, it's do we really take the gospel seriously? That we can open up and lay every truth bare, and then trust in the power of Jesus to make us as we ought to be? Or do we think that it's our job
Hmm.
to protect the picture that we have in our brain from being shattered? And like, I'm just not interested in that.
Another big thing, Grace came out with their results of their thing, the Chris Wright Rice investigation. And if my listeners have not read that yet or paid attention to that, Tate's Creek Presbyterian Church in Kentucky had, it seems like somebody came to them and said that they had some abusive interaction with recording artist Chris Rice. And because Tate's Creek had already dealt with a abuse allegation and investigation at their church, they did what they needed to do. And they once again reached out to a third party investigator. And the results of that study were, it was long. There's so many pages. I read through the whole Chris Rice investigation. And I remember when it first came out that like the first like reporting that we're going to be doing this investigation, come to us if you have anything to add to it. There are people that were friends with Chris Rice that were like, why are we talking about this? What if it's wrong? What if it's just a false allegation? And it became really clear to me after reading the report of why they needed to do this, because of the access he had with his platform and the severity of the allegations that we were able to then read in the final report that were horrible, that, parents had let their kids stay the night, their boys spend the night at his house. And the allegations seem very clearly to be corroborated that he abused these many boys over a long period of time. And I feel terrible for the friends of Chris. I feel worse for the survivors and families that trusted this person. But I feel like we've seen over and over again the importance of an independent investigation outside of denominations. You can have all the polity in the world and all the processes that.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're watching PCA and ACNA things play out in the news,
and they have a lot of polity.
They have a lot of system and hierarchy, and so I mean, I think we keep having like people are like congregationalism doesn't work because of the SBC, and there are particular hurdles to the SBC polity of making real changes. That's
Did you hear? And I talked to Pete Singer about investigations. He's executive director at Grace, and he said if there was some allegations that came up at my own church, I would remove myself, even though I know all about the right way to do things. He says, I have been groomed. I've been groomed by that community. And I thought, as much as we throw around the word groomer, for real, when you have a respect and admiration for somebody who very often happens when it's somebody who is your pastor, and it's the pastors that choose the ruling elders, right? They're part of choosing the other elders in the church that are part of these committees.
Yeah.
They're your friends. And of course they are. There's nothing wrong with them being your friends, but you cannot hold your friends accountable very easily when it's going to cost you something and them something. And it doesn't make these bad people, because I think they think they're doing, I think some people are doing the best they can. Some aren't. Some are, just like in any situation. But I think we really need more third-party investigator organizations out there. I only know of two, and then lawyers and law firms that might do it here and there. I know Grace and Guideposts, but and the people that are like really trained on this sort of thing.
The importance of an outside investigation. I mean, like, we already know that, right? Like in real life, we already know that.
I mean, even how we choose juries, right?
Right. Well, like, for example, right now, like, there's an investigation about some state law enforcement stuff in Oklahoma, but the OSBI, the Oklahoma State Board of Investigations, is not doing that. The FBI is, right?
Yeah.
And like, it's like DOJ FBI, not local field office FBI, right? And so we already know that in life. And I think one of the things that we kind of get in trouble with sometimes is that we think like, well, the church is different, it's special. But like, on the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, like, it's both a supernatural institution and a human institution.
Yeah.
And all we have to do is look at history to know that the church is capable of every kind of corruption that every other human institution is capable of. And because it's made up of human people. And so we shouldn't have lower standards for the church than we do for other human institutions. We should have higher standards because the supernatural aspect of the church is so important, right?
Yeah.
And so and so yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's a kind of deluding ourselves, right? And so many of these things that we've talked about have been examples of us deluding ourselves
Mhm.
until a story becomes really bad.
So you can't ignore it anymore. There
Yeah.
just keeps being like another drip, and then like the
Mhm.
the rush of like a waterfall of like, okay, I am standing here soaking wet. I cannot
Yeah.
say that I'm dry.
And that's how these things become news, right? If we were acting like if we were doing right things in all of these situations, then we would not have all of these news stories of big, huge, years long failures and corruptions and abuses of power because we'd be keeping those things in check
Mhm.
before they got to the New York Times or the Atlantic or the Houston Chronicle or wherever. Like the the thing is that when we like the reason these news stories exist
Mhm.
in these big things in the way that they do is because we let little things not matter over and over and over and over again, and until, like you said, yeah, the trickle became a waterfall. And like, if people are talking about a waterfall, like, that's not their fault. A waterfall is there and it's loud
Yeah.
and it's
And I think
dangerous. And
the frustrating thing is when you get to that point, and then the people that were denying it all along want to do a retrospective of like, how did we get here?
Mhm.
And you want to say, because you weren't listening when we
Yeah,
told you and you
yeah,
refused to see it. It's not
yeah.
always like that, but like it when those people are like, okay, now I'm on this side. Speaking of that, let's talk
Mm.
about Al Mohler and Trump.
Can we please? I
This
would
is
love to so
okay.
much.
So those that don't know, when Trump first announced his presidency, Mueller was very clear. He tweeted for all the world to see, which has been captured, to never,
Mhm.
ever, ever, basically, right?
Never ever, period.
Period. And then he came out and supported Trump.
Mhm.
It was before he ran. Was it while he was running the second time?
It was in 2020. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he flipped on that.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there lots of people have talked about it, but his reasoning has not really been theological so much as uh I don't know, political.
Utilitarian.
Yeah, pragmatic
Yeah.
for
Hmm.
him. But now here we are
Hmm.
as 2022 is waning. And Mueller, was it recently, maybe in the last month or two, he wrote something really condemning Trump.
Hmm.
Made it seem like supporting him is like terrible. And now I'm
Yeah.
like, what happens if DeSantis doesn't get the nomination? What I like
Hmm.
these people that have flip-flop back and forth, will they
Hmm.
flip and flop again? It
Yeah.
is so
It's very frustrating.
predictable
Yeah.
and
And
frustrating.
I think he is kind of a, let's say that he's kind of an avatar of the of kind of the white Southern evangelical psyche, and which is where we live.
That's
Um,
right.
like our One of the things that he wrote in 2016 is that, like, if he ever supported Donald Trump, that he would owe Bill Clinton an apology, because in the 90s, like, our whole ethos was character
Character.
matters,
Yeah,
personalis policy, like, and all those things that he said in 2016 were true. And then in 2020 he was like, okay, but we have to because of this other stuff. And then in 2022 he was like, oh, but wait, no, like, because it's and so what we see, I think, is yes, utilitarianism and political expediency and all of that. But I think there's another thing at work there, which is that, like, all of us have a tendency to convince ourselves that we're making principled decisions.
mhm.
And when it's clear that we're not, there
I'm
hasn't been
just
a
thinking how
there
we
hasn't
think
been a
we are
lot of
principled people, so our decisions must be principled.
right. And so there hasn't been a lot of evidence of there's no, like, saying, okay, I was wrong, right? There's just pretending like it never happened. because if you have to reconcile with being wrong,
Right.
then you have to say, okay, I'm not sure if these decisions were what I thought they were.
Oh, that's a good
Uh,
point because there was no apology.
right. And
Because
so,
we all change our mind on things. So
yeah,
that's not the problem so much as
right.
pretending like,
And so I think Al's just like kind of shameless flip-flopping is actually like the whole white evangelical mind in microcosm, right? Of we're just gonna pretend like this is what we've always believed and what we've always said, and like there's not gonna be any kind of acknowledgement of things changing or whatever, and like and then at the same time calling that like fidelity to unchanging universal truth, right?
mhm,
And so again, like we're back to the self-deluding of like if we can just say really loudly that this is what's always been true, then we don't have to reckon internally with okay, if I was wrong about this, what else was I
mhm,
wrong about?
right. Yeah, which is harder.
And and man, it's a lot easier to go through life believing everything that you think and believe is based on objective, right and wrong, unchanging principled truth. It's
Mhm.
harder when you know that is there and you're not sure if you're always hitting it or not.
Yeah. Ooh, that's good. Yeah, so also what happened this year, Brian Houston stepped down. Did you realize that it was this year? I feel like
I
that
did
was probably
it
January.
it
That's
feels a million
still
years
sort
ago.
of playing out.
Did the Hillsong documentary come out this year?
Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
did. When it came out exactly, I don't
I think
remember.
in the summer maybe.
So and then now he's sort of talking about starting his own thing. I think this is what non-denominational people do, but denominations, as we've already talked about, don't protect us from everything.
Mm,
RCIM, we had found out from Daniel Silliman's reporting. If you don't follow Daniel
mm,
Silliman, like he is doing investigative reporting.
mm.
There aren't a lot of religion journalists that do investigative reporting because it's a lot of work and you need
Yeah.
like a job to support you while you're doing this. Is
And you have
that he
to know
said
how to
that
navigate it all. Like
mhm,
it's
yeah,
confusing
the
if it's
so
not.
he
Mm,
actually, we found out that it was because he was going to report on the guideposts posts reporting for that report from RZIM.
mm,
That was what was the push for them to be like, hey, Guidepost did a report.
mhm,
Here's what they said. But they were holding on to it. They'd held on
mhm,
to it for months until they found out, Daniel was doing a report. Coincidentally, that
mhm,
reporting happened around the same time. I think that's interesting. Um, Also, as I've talked about here, the Ramsey documents in the court, the
mhm,
lawsuit filing there of having these leaders' own words in their emails and in their depositions, saying the most
mhm.
bizarre things.
Yeah, it's that like again, like shocked and horrified and zero surprises.
And
Like,
then also the fact that, I mean, it's not like we so quickly jump to the idea of like the talking about the sex aspect of these things. But what is
mhm,
even bigger is the fact that organizations like Ramsey will take the word of somebody whose character is clearly not trustworthy because they have
mhm,
corroboration and decide to still take their word for all these things, even when they hear and so they disregard all the other things. And there are
mhm,
other more serious allegations that were corroborated against Hogan. Then it'll make oral sex look like nothing.
mhm,
And still they chose to believe the guy that lied in front of them.
mhm,
It is, if you haven't read the documents, I'll link to them. It's all there. You don't have to take my word for it. It is crazy. Absolutely crazy. I think another thing that's happening in the world, and I think maybe we can end with this, is this online accountability that's sort of happening with pastors want to be influencers and share all their like quotes and like little quips and things. But then when people also publicly say, I don't understand this list of things I'm supposed to do in church to encourage my pastor, and I think it's weird that you called it a preaching event. They don't respond or they retreat to some other safe social media. I think seeing this like with Dane Ortland most recently,
Mhm.
we've seen it with Josh Howerton. There is this desire for a platform and a reach that you can get with social media, but an absolute resistance to pushback and criticism.
Mhm.
This is a thing. And we've been personally involved in these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, another recency bias thing, but like I think that what's happening with Twitter right now um is actually like a part of that story because it's been such, I mean, like I don't know that last summer or last year, whenever it was before that,
Yeah.
or maybe early this year, I don't know, time is a flat circle. Um, I don't know that the EC would have, of the SBC, would have voted to waive attorney-client privilege if it were not for Twitter, so that that Guidestone report, guidepost, so that that guidepost report could be done, right? Like, I mean, people watching on Twitter, like watching the meeting and tweeting at people like
It's real. It's
time
what's happening on the social media is real.
and so things like that, like where it really matters. I mean, like I know Jules Woodson's story
Mhm.
because of Twitter, and that was sort of what began me starting to look at other things, and that was years and years ago.
Mhm.
And so things like, again, like having institutions and spaces where we can trust information is going to matter, but then also having places where there's access, right?
Yeah.
Access to information, access to people, and access to accountability. Um, and so yeah, and so we see this sort of societal breaking down of those things, and then we see that in how it plays in things like, I mean, for the survivor community, social media gave them a voice that they
Mhm.
didn't have, and gave them a community and an avenue that they didn't have to seek justice. And so yeah, those things, that what's happening right now really matters in that
Yeah.
work.
Mhm.
um and yeah, and again, like you see the dynamic play out of self-protection versus telling the whole truth.
Yeah, and we can
And
see some of these stories change
mhm,
as people interact. I mean, I remember having, I mean, some of this came out of a conversation with some of the reporting on Andy Wood and seeing a friend of his, somebody who considers himself like a friend, a buddy, Josh Howerton, question some of the reporting and question some of the things that I had. So I responded to Howerton and just said,
mhm,
"Hey, I have some questions about the use of NDAs and your experience with them." And he was pretty clear about what he was saying and what he was communicating. And and he's like, never used any document like this, right? He said that for the whole world to see. And then we hear that they use a document just like that at his current church. And I hear from people that worked with him and in my town where he used to live and minister that they used similar documents. And the story keeps changing. And that would not have happened if it was not for social
mhm,
media. And not long after that, Josh decides, to change his Twitter to say, my team tweets for me, and he retreats. He retreated from Twitter to Instagram more. And I didn't want to. This wasn't a like I want to cancel Howerton. It was a let's be
mhm,
clear about this.
mhm,
And he could have said, "Yeah, I did that before I realized what a bad idea it was, and I was protecting myself and my church more than I should have."
mhm,
And I don't want to do that anymore. Like there is a way forward. There isn't like you did something bad and you don't ever get to come back from it. That's not the way the conversation goes. I mean, I think some people would say you can never come back from that, but NDAs aren't the same as sexual abuse. It's not the same.
Mhm.
It's spiritual abuse, it's power abuse, but
Mhm.
you can own that in a way and come back from that in a way that isn't the same. And but it takes a while.
Yeah.
It takes a while. It takes some, and you can't just expect someone to take your word for it when you've shown yourself, when there's evidence that shows that you have been untrustworthy or abusive yourself. It just takes time. And yeah, social media is shining a light in some of these dark places. And I see
Mhm.
those with power to lose complaining about that, calling it the mob, bragging about being canceled. And that's not it. That's not what's happening.
Mhm. I think everything that you just said is right. And I think that the other thing is that like there's um again like we're watching all of these things that are issues in the larger culture then play out in the evangelical subculture and in the church. And one of those things is NDAs. Like we just had a law signed to protect whistleblowers from NDAs. And so like it's going to be interesting to see because employment laws and things like that kind of are a little bit different
Mhm.
for religious institutions. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are ongoing that we're going to watch and see what happens as we go
Mhm.
forward. A lot of things happen in the world. I think a big thing also was the succession plan with Saddleback and Andy Wood, and
Mhm.
then Lori speaking up and going on the record with her
Mhm.
experience with Andy Wood. And she has agreed to come on the podcast. Actually, two of the Loris that spoke up this year, Lori Harding and Lori Adams
Adams.
Wood,
Mhm.
both of them are going to talk about that experience speaking on the record. You just don't know what's going to happen when that occurs, but it started a really interesting conversation. And as you know, some things that transpired in that were really disappointing, but better to know the truth and be disappointed than not know it all. Um, I know there's a lot of bad things happening. There's a lot of
Mhm.
good things happening too. But like I said at the beginning of our conversation, like I think we can become better people. We don't have to just become cynical. And we don't have to, it's not like Emily and I only look at bad news all day, every day.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
more.
no, there's I think that I mean if we had hours and hours to sit here like I just saw a news story today of a Lutheran I don't know if it's a synod or a church or like a I don't know Lutheran rules. Um but
Someday.
that they're building a housing development
Yeah.
to address homelessness in their area. Like that's an awesome story. Like I would love to talk about that story.
Yeah.
Um and so yeah, I mean, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we didn't really have. I mean, the Methodist schism that's happening and how, you know, that balances with the American church and the global church and different ideas of what it means to be liberal or
Yeah.
progressive or conservative, like in Africa as compared to here and things like that.
And the small things that we just don't know about, the difference that the church light being on and the door being open makes. Like Bob
Yeah,
Smetana said in his book, like even when we want to burn it all down, there are some real benefits to having that door open,
yeah.
even with all the mess. There are individual lives being changed. And I'm not an ends justify the means person. I'm
Yeah.
a how can we continue to have lives changed and lean into Jesus, the Holy Spirit doing that work
Yeah.
while throwing the ugly out.
Yeah, and I think a good way to look at it is to look at it as sanctification, right? Like if like Curtis Chang talks about how institutions also bear the image of God because they're made up of image bearers. And so in the same way that we individually want to be more and more formed by the Spirit into the image of Jesus, right? As we grow and mature and and have things revealed in us and all those things, like also want that to be the case for the church, right? Like that's the idea of semper reformanda. It's that like
Mm-hmm.
it's that the church itself is also being sanctified, and and so we don't look at these things as attacks against the church, but as God revealing things for the sake of our sanctification,
It's an opportunity.
so that we can become more what we're supposed to be. And so we're not being conservative or being progressive, but we're pressing on to being more of who we are. And that's gonna sometimes look like different things. And but yeah, looking at telling the truth about ourselves as a first step in sanctification. But again, like if we're going to take the gospel seriously, that can't be all that we're doing. Then there has to be repentance and restoration and change,
Yeah.
and the proof of the spirit at work there. And so yeah, sometimes those good things, just like in a person, coexist with all these other things that we've talked about, right? And so it's not that we set them up against each other. It's that we reveal things that we can root out so that those good things can grow and flourish and make us who we're supposed to be.
I like it. That's a good way to end this conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this extra content. If you want access to more Untangled Faith, join us at patreon.com/untangledfaith. That's patreon.com/untangledfaith.